I'm super excited to be here. I've already had a ton of really interesting conversations, and I hope that the weekend will continue this way. I'm not an expert in machine learning at all. Sorry, Golan. I've probably been in this field for maybe a year and a half. I'm also not a media artist. I've had a long-standing interest in art, and I've done a bunch of sculpture work, like this. This is a bunch of metal sculpture. I'm actually a biochemist by training, so I started making sculptures of protein molecules for fun. This is one made with 3D printing and glass casting. But I work at Google, and there's a guy at Google last year called Alex Mortvincev who first came up with Deep Dream, and he posted this picture internally. And I was like, whoa, what is this? And I could see it was based on this photo, but this convolutional network algorithm that he had come up with had generated this picture, or a similar picture. This is not actually the first picture. And it looked like creativity to me, honestly. And I obviously understood that this was a very simple system. I had learned about convolutional networks by that point. So I started digging around and was very interested in this. So I want to tell you a little bit about sort of some of the explorations I've done since then. And then later on, I'm going to talk a little bit more generally about neural networks and what they do. And it's actually dovetailing really nicely with what you were talking about mapping representations to each other. OK, so super quick 5-minute neural network primer. And only really convolutional supervised neural networks. So a neural network basically is composed of a bunch of very simple units that could perform extremely simple calculations, usually something like an addition and application of a simple mathematical function. There's lots of them, and they're wired together using connections. The connections carry weights, and the signal that passes through those connections multiplied by those weights. And then typically, but not always, neural networks are arranged in layers, as you can see here. And sometimes all of the units of one layer are wired to all of the units of the other layer. It's called a fully connected layer. Or sometimes they are only connected to sort of a receptive field of the previous layer, and then it's more like a convolutional layer. And typically, these networks have a bunch of layers here. I have 4. Modern networks have 30, or even there's one paper with 1,000 from Microsoft. And then here's an example problem that people like to solve using machine learning, or particularly neural networks, where you have image recognition. So you want to show it an image, and you want the network to basically do a semantic parsing of the image. So say if it's a cat or a dog in this very simple example. And the way this works is that one end of the neural network is sort of connected to the image. It ingests the pixels. And then these activations flow through the network layer by layer, passing from one layer to the next, until it reaches the end of the network. Typically, on the output side of the network, you have many fewer neurons than on the input side, and each of these neurons is sort of wired to your interpretation. And this is really imposed by the trainer. This is a supervised environment, so whoever sets this up says, oh, well, I want this neuron to represent cat, and this represent dog. And at first, of course, this doesn't work at all. The weights are randomly initialized, and it will give random answers. And the trick here is, of course, you showed lots of examples. This is no surprise to you. And so you showed lots and lots of pictures of cats, lots and lots of pictures of dogs. This is a hard problem, of course, because dogs and cats actually look very similar to each other, even though they don't to us. In fact, it was so easy for humans to distinguish them that as recently as 2007, Microsoft had a captcha based on this very problem. They would show you 10 pictures, and you have to get all of them right, which is trivial for humans and really difficult for machines. By now, it's trivial for machines also. That captcha is not, I don't think, is active anymore. Although apparently now we just ask people, are you human? And you click yes. Not really sure what that's about. OK, so how do you actually train? So you show it one example, and it's going to give some random answer, in this case, the wrong answer, dog. And you can calculate basically a difference between those two. And then you can adjust the weights of the previous layer based on the error that the network made. And you propagate this error back up the network. It's called backpropagation. And you do this to each layer in turn, flowing the errors all the way back, not so fast, all the way up to the last layer, and you update those weights. You do this over and over again. hopefully, if this works, you're going to get a system that can generalize. So you showed a picture that it's never seen before of a cat or a dog, and it'll make a decision. It will still make a decision on any picture you show it. It's basically dividing the space of possible pictures into regions that it believes belong to certain semantic classes. So coming back to Deep Dream, how does this work? How is this picture generated? You don't necessarily have to adjust the weights. You can also adjust anything else you want in response to something that's happening in the network. So in the case of Deep Dream, you can pick a layer, say that one, and you can say, okay, well, how do we adjust the pixels in the image to amplify the response that this layer is currently giving? So no matter what picture you show the network, there's going to be some response in every layer as the information moves through. If we pick a layer, it has some internal representation, doesn't have to be the last layer, and we simply say, how do we make this particular interpretation stronger, and what's the delta we need in order to achieve that effect? You propagate the delta through the network, but instead of adjusting the weights, you adjust the image. There should be an arrow there, but it's not. But basically, you apply the gradients to the image. And if you do this iteratively, what happens is that if at the beginning there was a slight bias towards any particular interpretation, that interpretation is going to get amplified until you see a much stronger version of it. And then you get all these crazy psychedelic images, just like this. So I was really fascinated by this. I was interested to see if you can use this to make art with it. One of the first things that I tinkered with was to see if you can get rid of this initial photo. I was like, okay, well, this is sort of cheating. You already have a photo there. I'm much more interested about what's coming out of the network as opposed to the photo I fed in. So the first thing I did was just A, start with random noise, and then B, apply the algorithm iteratively, basically zooming in each time. And that's how you get these Deep Dream zooms, and hopefully this will play. So very quickly, the network completely forgets what the initial conditions are. This is completely chaotic. The starting conditions matter a lot. And it's also fractal in the sense that it's self-similar, because the network has a limited amount of knowledge it has. And so you're going to get the same stuff over and over again as you zoom through this sort of crazy landscape. Also matters which layer you amplify, of course. This is a fairly close to the final interpretation, so you get very high-level concepts. If you choose a layer that's much closer to the image, you get much more simple things like this coming out. And this is basically starting to kind of understand what each layer actually is doing. If you look at the structure of the neural network, each layer only sees the previous layer, and so each layer is making some sort of decisions or interpretations of the previous layer. And what's unbelievably magic about this whole process is it totally self-organizes into this thing just by essentially applying boundary conditions on the input and the output. But in between, it's necessarily self-organizing in such a way that the first layer extracts corners and edges, and then the next layer has some sort of higher dimensional representation of those, all the way up to when you get close to the final interpretation, you get like, is there an eye or not? Or another neuron might take on, is there a cheek or not, whatever. The final neurons then base their decision just on those computed features, and then make the final decision that you actually asked for. But in between, it's like anything goes. And it's actually very difficult to understand what exactly it's doing. And we've seen already a bunch of tools of looking at these intermediate representations. And Deep Dream actually started as an attempt to understand these, and then got totally derailed into fun things. And this is actually not very good for that. All right, so here's some more examples simply of stuff that we made. Broccoli baskets, I suppose, I don't really know. Gates, this network was trained on a bunch of different places. Mountain ranges. And I've had a number of conversations today and yesterday about like the role of the artist. This is very much a curatorial process. It's experimentation. It's like throwing paint to the wall and seeing what you like, trying again, changing it. There's not very much a very specific intention in this kind of thing. But it's really beautiful imagery. I really like it. You can get a tremendous range of effects with this kind of thing. You can also, you don't have to print it. So this one is, for example, laser etched into a piece of wood. And it's actually cool. It's got kind of this sort of 3D thing going on. Okay, so but what if you actually wanted to understand what one single neuron does? Well, you could do the same thing, simply amplifying the response of a single neuron and ignoring everything else. And if you do that, you can basically, now you're optimizing the image in such a way as to make that one neuron fire, which, again, there's a lot of different images that are going to make that neuron fire, but the optimization process will tend towards images that strongly have the features that are necessary to make that neuron fire. So you get these cool kind of abstract images of different things. This particular network knows about 1,000 different things, and you can do that to each of the neurons in this process. You have to apply a bunch of sort of image regularization tricks. In this case, I'm applying a bilateral filter between different gradient applications to the image, which basically has the effect of smoothing out noise but leaving edges around, which is why you get sort of more crisp representations. But it's actually deviating in a sense from just optimizing the image. Now you're adding additional constraints or additional loss functions. So just a few more examples. Artichokes or wine bottles. I love these images because, what is this? Sea turtles. There are no turtles in this image whatsoever. There are only turtle parts. And they're all, it's kind of recombined in weird ways, but I challenge you to find a turtle in it. But everybody says turtles, and I obviously see turtles too. Part of this hallucination is completed in your own mind. You're given the right features, just like the neural network does that interpretation, and you're filling in the blanks and you're seeing those turtles in your mind. It evokes turtleness in you, right? that latent turtleness that you didn't know about. The other thing that's interesting about doing this is that it reveals some of the biases in the network. This was actually, there's a lot of examples of this. In this particular case, all of the training images of saxophones also have people holding saxophones, and so obviously when the neural network doesn't know that's not part of the saxophone, it will literally pick up any correlation, anything that correlates with the right answer. And when you hallucinate it back, you get those parts. You see all the shoulders and part of the faces, but only half faces. You can also combine this with style transfer. I don't really have time to talk about style transfer. This is something that Leon Gattus from Germany came up. Super, super cool stuff. It's using neural network to sort of semantically change the image. In this particular case, it's applying the style of one image to another image. You can combine this with Deep Dream too, or class visualization, to sort of change the look and feel of the image. So here, the style was a photo of a violin. In this case, the class was pictures, and the style was a picture of flowers. And this is really nice. It's also, you can use this to increase the resolution of your images. Because you can Deep Dream at a low resolution, scale it up, and then apply the style at a higher scale, and then you get a much higher quality image. And it works as art. Okay, so much for Deep Dream. So what else can you do with this stuff? One interesting thing you can do, because the 1,000 different classes that the network was trained on share features in the layer before, semantically similar things that also look similar, share the similar features that are necessary to recognize them. Therefore, they also share similar weights. So you can use the weights of the last layer like features. So for each class, you get kind of a feature vector, which is all of the weights that lead to that neuron. And if you then use t-SNE, which has already been mentioned by Gene and others, you can t-SNE all of these weight vectors. And then you can use the positions to specifically deep dream that class at that location. And what you get is kind of a map of all of the things that that network knows about in a sort of artistic way. It's not particularly useful necessarily, but it's fun to look at. So honestly, obviously all the dogs, this is where all the puppy slugs come from. This is this peninsula here on this map. They all love to live together, including, where is he gone? Teddy bears. Teddy bears look like dogs. It ends up over there. Some other things are not as obvious or intuitive, and I actually don't fully understand how the network even works this out. For example, violins do end up next to saxophones and brass instruments, which semantically makes sense, but I don't really understand why, because they don't look the same. They should look very different from each other. So it might be that it's actually the background or some other information that's correlating them. Like they tend to crop up in the same kinds of environments, but don't necessarily look the same. And that's the thing, if you don't really know what the network has learned, it will do whatever it can to figure out this problem. Anyway, so this is kind of fun. So there's this map. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about is sort of a more general view and maybe some philosophical ramblings. So please indulge me. So what is actually happening here? You get, on one hand, you have this very high dimensional space, the image. In this very basic example, it's already has 72 dimensions. Typical networks would have more like 40,000 dimensions on the input, like 200 by 200 input patch. And the output is very low dimensional, or comparably low dimensional. In my example, 2 dimensions, in typical examples would be 500 dimensions. And so what this whole thing is doing is it's figuring out a mapping from the high dimensional space into the low dimensional space. So if you want to think about this like that, all of these dogs and cats, they inhabit this really high dimensional space and they're sort of scattered around. Like if you think about all of the different things all of the different images that are all cats, they're not similar to each other at all. Like the pixel values on a really immediate basis are completely different from each other. And that's why the problem is hard. And what the network is learning, it's learning essentially to distort the space gradually, layer by layer, until all of the things that you want to be similar, that you consider semantically similar, end up together. So this is sort of what I'm trying to display here with these stars and triangles. The stars represent one thing, the triangles represent another thing, they're sort of scattered around, and the network transforms the space so that they're all together. And Chris Olave has an amazing blog on this, by the way, which I highly recommend. I took this GIF from his page. It's really, it beautifully demonstrates this. Actually, let me let's go to the beginning here. So let's imagine your problem is to distinguish the red from the blue, and the easiest classifier is to draw a line. Say everything on one side of the line is one thing, and everything on the other side is the other thing. You can't do this with 2 spirals. So when you do this with a neural network, what it's doing, and Chris visualized this in this incredibly intuitive way, it's just twisting space. It's doing all these transformations on this high dimensional space, in this case it's 2 dimensions, until the 2 spirals are pulled apart. And sometimes you need more than 2 dimensions, like if it was a donut with the blue stuff inside, that you actually need a 3rd dimension to pull it out. You can't get it through the red stuff. But either way, as long as you have enough dimensions, which is why sometimes your networks need to be a sort of minimum size to solve the problem, you end up with, at the end of the day, you end up with a linearly separable problem. So from a philosophical point of view, if you generalize this a little bit, you could think of that as perception, right? Like it's turning the real world, the really high-dimensional, noisy world, into what we sort of intuitively think of as knowledge. And if you go the other way, you have something sort of roughly akin to imagination or hallucination, where you go the other way, you project back into the real world stuff that also has this effect on you. So for example, if I note that the high-dimensional space is way, way more volume than low-dimensional space. So I can take an existing mapped cat on one side and map it to any number of points that all, if I ran them back through the network, would still elicit that same catness on the other side, right? Or, which is sort of what style transfer essentially does, right? Like it's saying it's the same content, but with a different style. There's a lot of freedom there. Or you can take some other previously not mapped point that still in the same space or vicinity and create a cat that hasn't been created before. It doesn't exist in the real space. You can also think of it as like, sometimes think of it as like a Fourier transform. It's like taking it from the pixel domain into the semantic domain and back. And sometimes there are operations that are easier to do in the semantic space. Sometimes there are operations that are easier to do in the pixel space. And this allows you to convert between the two. So if you take this a little bit further, we have data and use perception or learning to go one way to knowledge, or use hallucination to go the other way. You can also look at the neural network sort of as a function, essentially. You invert the function. So during learning, you take data and you try and map it to knowledge, adjusting the weights. When you go back, you take some knowledge you want to represent, and you fiddle with the data until it matches that knowledge. So I think this is a sort of interesting way to think about it. And if we then put two of those together, this is what we've been talking about, right? Like the same individual, if you like, can go forwards and back and create a new cat. You'll recognize this probably as a cat. I think it's amazing, by the way, that you can look at all these pictures, and it's trivial for us to know these are all cats. I don't think even the convolutional networks can do this right now. These are sort of levels of abstraction that we haven't quite reached with the technology. But you can also look at it the other way around. So if you have one creature, thing, that takes their internal thought and projects it out into the real world, because the internal representations are inaccessible to anybody else, another entity can then consume that, and hopefully, if it works, will also think cat. If that double mapping is accurate, then it's basically a language. That's what language is. It's transferring thought from one person to the other via the real world plane. And if it's very permissive, then we would probably call it art, where it's a less precise transfer of ideas, and it gives more room for interpretation, perhaps. So my final point is that I've been thinking a lot about why do we care when we look at somebody's art? We're somehow connecting, right? Like we feel like there's a process of empathy with the other entity that made the thing. And maybe your interpretation is completely way off, and that's still a totally valid way to interact with art, I think. But there is still that idea that that person had some internal state that led them to make this particular art. And we somehow care about other people's internal states. They're interesting to us. So I think these systems are super simple, and perhaps we don't really care about what their internal state is. But I could imagine that eventually these systems become complex enough that it's interesting to us what their internal states actually look like, and then perhaps we will care about machine-generated art in that way, because we're starting to empathize with that hidden internal state. Anyway, so I would love to have more conversations about this if you're interested. And in many ways, these are very old ideas that have been thought about for thousands of years. But the fact that we have these artificial neural networks to play with this sort of gives us an opportunity to kind of study this process in detail. So try and tease it apart and figure out what's actually going on there. All right, that's all I got. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Rebecca and Mike.